We are live? All right. Welcome once again to C9K, the show where we talk cybersecurity, Kubernetes, cloud native, following trends, WTFs, big money, and every episode we deep dive on some tech. My name's Steve Jaguar.
And I'm his co-host, Mike Foster, and we have a packed show. It's been 2 weeks coming back from vacation, but we're going to be talking Kubernetes 1.28. We also have some more drama in the open source world and some big spenders, including SUSE, Endor. Happy Friday, and welcome to C9K.
Okay, what's new?
What's new? Yes, it's been 2 weeks. You've been traveling all over the US. I've been on vacation. It was a nice one. I got a lot of sun. But we came back and there was some serious news. Some that came out right after our show 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And some that broke last night. So we got a packed show. As always, hit the little subscribe button, hit the bell so you know we're going live. It should tell you 30 minutes before. And we try to put up the episodes a couple days early to give you a heads up. Steve, you've been traveling all over the US doing a bunch of events.
Yeah.
What's going on?
I did Hacker Summer Camp, as it's known, which is the back-to-back of BSides, slightly overlapping with Black Hat, slightly overlapping with DefCon, progressing all the way from Monday to the following Sunday. Great way to get exhausted because it all happened in Las Vegas. So I think I was kicking something like 25,000 steps a day, just trying to get from thing to thing. And my quick summary, which I will expand on perhaps in the hot take section. BSides is still amazing. I like all BSides events. A little bit like Forward CloudSec. It's one of these, there's not that many people there. There's not that many vendors. It's almost all practitioners, to the point where they, like, I don't know if you've ever had this. Anybody ever come up to you when you're standing at a Red Hat booth and go, "So Red Hat, what is this?"
Mm-hmm.
And you're like,
"Yeah, tell me a little bit about Red Hat."
Yeah,
what does Red Hat do?
Really? Yeah. Wait, I had that sometimes with like Palo Alto. Is that where you are or who you are? It's like, well, so that's great in a way. That's why you're there, is to try and get involved with the community, and got a lot of great feedback and talked about some of the new trends and that. Loved it. Then went to Black Hat, and the vendor floor was so big, I got lost. I had to do a talk, and I almost didn't make it because I was just going through like this. It was like that movie Maze Runner. It was exactly like that.
And Black Hat was in Mandalay Bay, right?
Yeah, Mandalay Bay is just, it feels like it's a hotel only designed for gigantic, ridiculous conferences. This huge floor. It was pretty good. So I saw a lot of people. I knew the usual hallway con. Yes, everybody was there. Couldn't stop running into Ashish Rajan and Shilpi, who seemed to be, I think there might be duplicates of them. They seem everywhere when they're doing the cloud security podcast stuff. And then finally, I got to go to Black Hat, and it's Black Hat, but I can't help but say I was a little disappointed in that one. But that's just me. I'll expand on that a little later in my hot take.
Yeah, you were definitely busy while I was vacationing. Got to play a little bit around with Podman Desktop in my spare time, so I'll have the tool for you at the end of the show. But other than that, let's get into the news. Yes,
right, let's get it up.
Some breaking news coming in here. Well, not breaking. This has been a long time coming, but Kubernetes 1.28 is officially out. Armo did a release just detailing the security features.
Yeah, I felt it.
Yeah,
I was looking for. As soon as Kubernetes comes out, everyone's like, "Here's what's new," and there are articles that go into every little API change, and it's like, all right. Let's try and find somebody who can just summarize. And Armo did a good job, like particularly the advancement of common expression language based admission policies and webhook match conditions. Moving to beta, right? It was an alpha before, and it's a change to, I guess, admission controller policies. And I'm wondering, I haven't really dove deep into like yet another language that somebody's making me have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
But what is your impression of? I don't know. Have you? Before
I haven't dove that much into this, especially because it's in beta. Moving pretty fast. Yeah. Alpha to beta in 2 releases is typically quick for Kubernetes, so it must be a feature that I think a lot of different groups are working on. It's definitely a way to configure Kubernetes, I think, at the start. I don't think you're going to be making any changes in your cluster and doing this when it's up or it's in testing or it's in staging. But if you use something like Rancher, or if you're using Ansible or like advanced cluster management with Red Hat, and you can go and start the cluster up, have these specific policies in place by default, it just makes sense, I think. And then you're going to have your security runtime security tool to do enforcement. But realistically, we don't want to be doing enforcement. So I think it's a cool feature. How and who actually implements it is the thing that I care about.
Yeah, and I'm actually wondering if because the guys at Kairono, for example, are heavily involved in CNCF, and I'm looking at this going, does this kind of eat a bit of their lunch as well? Or am I off track? Maybe a little bit, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. It really depends on the teams and who's using it. If somebody's deep in the weeds in Kubernetes and, an operations guru setting all this up, they're going to find a lot of power in this format. I think that some people like their tools. It's like, I know Kaiverno does this, I'm just going to stick with it. It has a broader scope. So why, shift between 2 tools? I think it's a great tool for the 5-person team, 1 operations, 4 DevOps to say, hey, here's some security features, here's some guardrails that we can implement at the beginning in the cluster, right? I think that's where this fits.
Should move on. Reduction of secret-based service account tokens. That's hard to say, actually.
Yeah, especially on a Friday.
Yeah. Tokens stored as secrets allow pods to communicate API. Oh my God, I've got something in my eye. Talk for 2 seconds. My eyes watering.
I mean, I think this is just, you get into Kubernetes and there's 1,000 tokens and you're like, you have no clue what relates to what. And so the primary goal is to shrink it down, or at least make it more knowledgeable as to what they're doing, what each secret or token is associated with. The other funny thing is, like, as you shrink the amount of tokens, I feel like even though you lower the surface area, you also maybe give privileges too much to like 1 token and make it easier for somebody to be like, I want that one. Ooh. Right? It's always a funny back and forth in security, but as they don't exactly tell you which ones they removed here. I'm sure they do in the notes, but I think that's what you'd have to dig in to see why they did it.
Yeah. This one here, secret pulled images. I quite like this one. The idea of, if not present, pull. But there seems to be, I don't know if the word secret pulled images is what they are calling it, but they're playing out a scenario here. They're written where an attacker gains access to the net, manipulates the image, and because it's not, and therefore it doesn't go and check. And they're looking at an enhancement that compares, the present with the source to make sure that if we're not going to pull it because it's already present, is it still the same?
Yeah. I mean, I think this goes hand in hand with the container image signature handling underneath.
There you go. Yep.
Realistically, if somebody has access to the node, do you think that they're just going to change one of the images and then wait for you to pull the next one and then just hope so that they can run it? No, they're just going to run the container that they want to run if they have access on the host, right?
I have maybe a counter argument to that, because if you remember Dirty Pipe was a method with which you could manipulate what seemed like an immutable container that was stored in the local registry within Kubernetes. So if it was pulling it locally without comparing it, you could make a permanent change. Even if you killed it and it came back up, it had your modification. So I wonder if that's a response to that.
Interesting. And that makes sense. I guess if you were using something that's local, also you're living off the land, you're less likely to get seen by security tools because it's a workload that's been verified. It does make sense.
And then, but it does go hand in hand with container image scanning handled based on SigStorm. So not getting into that one. KMS v2 improvements. I don't use it, so I don't know, but I think once again, we haven't said it yet. Go check out all of these links are down below in the description if you want to explore. It's a pretty short article, so not a whole lot to dive into from a security perspective. Lots more out there, though. Kubernetes 1.28 seems like a pretty huge release.
Yeah, and if you wanted to see the full list, it's always on Kubernetes.io. They do a whole breakdown. And congrats to the people who step up for the release cadence. I know they always have a couple, either students or people that are in school that manage the release cycle. I forget what the correct term is for what they do, but we met one of them up in Waterloo.
Oh, yeah.
Right? She was leading the release. So congrats
Is
to that
Grace?
one. I think so.
She's at your meetup.
Yeah. So very cool. Always interesting to see young talent, get brought in the community. So congrats.
Excellent. All right, moving swiftly on. Not to be self-indulgent in this one because it is a Palo Alto blog, but it does raise some interesting things. It's a little self-indulgent because Yaron, who wrote this, did write the tool he refers to called Piper, which is it's for something like permissions and pipeline and permissions. But he's talking about GitHub Action permissions in the terms of least privilege, because the way GitHub works, it used to be most privilege, and I've had talks about this, which I did at your meetup, and where up to a certain February 2020, any repo up to February 2023 still has a most privileged model within GitHub Action permissions. And he highlights that here, actually, coincidentally, which is good. But he talks about taking all permissions away and then using tailored permissions and the value of it. And so what they did, just to see how bad it would be, is they created, there it is, Piper, Pipeline and Permissions. It's a tool that I think they're going to open source. It's not, It's like on the edge, but they analyzed the top 1,000 GitHub actions in the marketplace, and even to an extent, to actions that depended on the actions. So they did a bit of a tree and just started looking at how many popular packages have a dependency on an action that still has most privilege and how bad that can be. So it's worth a little bit read. Some nice stats. 93% of the public GitHub repos have at least one workflow with excessive permissions. And there's a really good talk they did at DefCon about how easy it could be within the top 1,000 packages to find a most privileged scenario that is your then attack vector.
And a lot of these are on the marketplace, right? That's the purpose of this, to see the public ones. Right. And so you can imagine what the private ones might look like too, right?
Precisely.
Where, one team just gives himself an excessive amount of permissions to make sure everything works in the pipeline, and then never goes back to check it.
It's amazing, because the idea came from some work that was done last year, and then this sort of discovery that, wow, GitHub Actions, there's a lot of excessive ones out there, and the lesser maintained ones don't tend to think they're a target, because they're like, hardly anybody uses me. But if that happens to be in the supply chain for a major one, it didn't take that long to work out the graph to find out where you could strike. Anyway, pretty interesting. So check that out.
Yeah, you have your next talk.
Yeah, well, he did the talk.
Okay. So, on the back of that, well, this kind of is in line with some of our big spender news coming up. You post this one, how Snyk fails. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, I had to actually do a free trial on this guy's website in order to see the whole article. Frank Wang. I'm going to dive in and see if it's worth it. But good article. He's talking about, he does a really good job, actually, at the beginning, because I got drawn in just by how Snyk fails as a title. And then and does a great job of talking about how well Snyk has done in terms of SCA, land and expand, fueling growth, becoming a full platform and competing with a lot of the bigger players. That they compare them with Synopsys, they compare them with Lacework and Wiz, and how they're trying to go into cloud security, etc. So they kind of really started on the left and started
Mhm.
moving right, as opposed to a lot of companies that kind of started on the right and started moving left. And then starts talking about the downfall. And I was a little surprised that he's essentially picking things like the code owners, GitHub, maybe even GitLab, I can't remember if he says GitLab, and like JFrog as the potential threats to companies like this, and potentially to all the security companies that are wrapping themselves around these tools that host the code, as opposed to the power that something like GitHub, owned by Microsoft, therefore can have limitless funding just in exchange for the amount of data that they have by owning GitHub, can potentially start pushing everybody out, not just Sneak. I don't know. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One, the security aspect to it, and then the go-to-market motion, right? One is taking advantage of developers, pushing things, starting to the left and then pushing things right. So if you get developer buy-in, you tend to get a pretty sticky product. You'll get people that will vouch for it all the way up the chain. So, GitHub, there are developers that, they rely on that. That is one of the stickiest products you're ever going to use. So it just makes sense that if you can build security features and functionality into that tool, then why do you have two? What's the purpose of two? So, I mean, it just makes sense. I think that from a natural evolution, that's what's going to happen. I think a lot of analysts and just in general in space want security in everything. I mean, monitoring tools need to have vulnerability analysis now. GitHub and GitLab need to do security vetting, and security, I mean, it needs to be built into every part of the supply chain, and we're just seeing it kind of shake loose in weird ways. That's one of them.
Yeah. And he also, I think one of the other points he made was that as companies have a core competency that makes the world fall in love with them in their early stages, they sometimes can let that innovation like just sit and go a little stale, because I think he's commenting that even just GitHub's baked in SCA is starting to compete with the quality of what Sneak had in the beginning, because they're too busy expanding to pay the same level of attention to their original core competency, I should say.
Oh yeah, I mean, we mentioned Socket 2 weeks ago that got funding in the SCA space. We have friends obviously at Endor Labs that are in that space as well. So you have that core competency. You try to branch out to capture as much of the market, but if you lose sight of what your product is,
take your eyes off the prize.
Yeah, and when those contracts, those 2, 3, 4 year enterprise contracts come up, and your product isn't what it says it was, gets dicey. Cool. All right, we got 2 more to go before our hot take. What's next on the docket?
That's just a tool. Maybe we'll do it at tool time at some point. I just thought it crossed my path, called Noir, an attack surface detector from. Now hold on. What we also could use is a bit of Grammarly in here, but it's not from source code, from source code, to detect language and framework from source code, and then find API endpoints and start to poke at them. And from what I can see, good language coverage, auto detection, easy install, a lot of parameters, but it looks like it just goes through your code, finds essentially any potentially visible API endpoints, so that it suddenly knows this is how you're going to be interacted with, and then starts to fashion a sort of, I don't know, what's like a penetration testing framework based on source code, which I think could cut down a lot of time.
Yeah, path, method, parameters, headers, protocols. So it's like it doesn't do it for all the languages. For example, Go does URL and method.
Right.
Ruby does URL method parameters. Well, yeah, it looks like it's testing the app and maybe throwing a bunch of junk at it, seeing what breaks.
Yeah, it seems I like it. I think it would be pretty useful. I mean, maybe dive in at some point to see how hard is this? Because could you run this on something more cloud native, and then can you combine it with other like pre-existing tools? Food for thought for future. It looks pretty good.
Cool. And the last one, CNAP goat. I think we've talked about this before, right?
There's a lot of goats. It's getting a little ridiculous.
Too many goats. Tom Brady, the OG.
Yeah. Open source project designed to modularly provision vulnerable by design components in cloud environments. Like a lot of the goats that have come out today, it's like OWASP top 10s. You make a project that you use to test your platform, and then you give it away to the world. But it's automatically, probably an hot take here, is you designed it to make your platform look good, but you also designed it functionally to test your platform. Mm-hmm. And it's a good thing. And the idea to me of a CNAPP goat or Cloud Native Application Protection Platform goat is that this has got to be complex. People are saying that they're a platform play are protecting you from a vast amount of different angles. We're talking API security, we're talking Kubernetes runtime security, we're talking cloud CSPM, cloud security. Like, how can you make one goat to rule them all? It seems a little bit ambitious, potentially impossible. So this crossed my path. It seems like maybe a bit of marketing, but either way, I got to take it for a spin because I don't know. I got to try it.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. It uses Pulumi. It says it wants all the major cloud SDKs and Pulumi. So I'm assuming that if you go in, it will spin up a resource in AWS, GKE, something like that. You can input all your Kubernetes manifests, and then it will test it and run it against those. So pretty cool that it gave this setup as well, and not just, hey, install a bunch of things in and let it run. So pretty
very cool.
I'll let you test it out. Steve's up for today. It's time for his hot take.
All right, my hot take. I alluded to it at the very beginning when I was talking about Hacker Summer Camp with BSides, Black Hat, and DefCon. The triple threat and all targeting different types of people and practitioners, with BSides being really hands-on techie, a lot of students there. Black Hat being pretty corporate. There's so many vendors. It's, like I said, I got lost just trying to wander around that village. And DefCon being the quintessentially hacker fest, meaning there's people who wander around in costumes with masks and helmets and literal tinfoil hats. And to get in, they encourage you that you only pay cash. There's no traceability, no cameras. The badges are usually some kind of a clever toy or electronic thing, and people take great pride in all the different badges they've collected through the years, and they're wearing them. The atmosphere in the community is amazing. That is good about DefCon. The thing I didn't like this year about DefCon is that last year it was $300. You got into the queue. I think they opened the queue at 7 p.m. the night before, but then they didn't start allowing you to buy tickets until the morning. So this odd encouraging you to queue up with your money and communicate with your fellow hackers. But what I didn't like is that there was $300 last year, and you got this amazing, complicated electronic badge that was a capture the flag. This year, it was $460, I believe. And you got a badge that was okay. It was nowhere near as good as the one last year. And I think somehow half of them got lost, and you got a piece of cardboard and it didn't really work. And it was like, that was the initial red flag where I was like, okay, I'm paying 50% more to go to this conference. And, if I got 20% more, I would be pretty happy, but I didn't see any more. I saw almost an identical hacker village. I saw identical vendor village. I saw identical, very similar, same venue, same everything, same cloud village, same biohacking. But when you went to some of the niche areas like Cloud Village and Biohacking Village and AppSec, you were queuing. If you had to see a talk at 3 o'clock, you had to be there at 1 just to get into a huge, crowded, epic fire hazard of a queue that you just paid 50% more to wait. And it felt like almost worse than a reInvent kind of scenario. Additionally, when you walked around Caesars Forum, it was so packed. It looked like they had not only upped the price, but they've allowed 50% more people to actually get into the conference. So it was so crowded and so claustrophobic that it was a little bit unpleasant to even be at. And other examples where if I just wanted to go to the vendor village and buy some cool hacking gadgets, last year I walked in and I bought some cool stuff. This year, once again, I was in a queue that took half an hour just to even go in to see if I might want to get something that I didn't already have. So I feel like it got a little undercurrent of commercialization where I don't know, and you know, not to be a little bit conspiracy theorist, I like the anonymity of it, but $460 times how many people are there? 10,000? That's a interesting, that already, I'm not going to speculate, but I think DefCon needs to dial it back a little bit, you know, embrace the original reason why it existed, and maybe be a little bit more forthcoming about where's all this money going. Such as the end of my hot take. DefCon kind of.
I got you
Nice.
right in the middle of that.
Got it.
Yeah, it's a hot take. It sounded like a long Google thread review, but
Yeah.
that's very interesting. It's the price went up, but it also got super packed, which is kind of tough because it's like, do you up the price even more to limit the amount of people so that it feels less claustrophobic? It's a tough one that I don't necessarily envy about the event planning team.
Yeah.
Or maybe just get a bigger space. Anyways, on to the WTF section. So some crazy news. I don't know if anybody's been following, but the open source licensing has been, well, the licensing hasn't changed, but how people are using the licensing is changing. And HashiCorp came out with a doozy. So I found this one. HashiCorp moves to a business source license that will allow Hashi to continue investing in all its products and marketing spend. Basically, what they did was they forked all their code, put it behind closed doors, and then open sourced the builds after. And they're going to be contributing to their own code upstream and not maintaining downstream, which is interesting.
Yeah. And what did people say about it? By the way, I added a second article here on the same subject.
It too, Hashi?
Yeah. They're comparing, they justified it by comparing themselves to other companies like MariaDB, et cetera, that have done the exact same thing to avoid people just, you know, free stuff. In a way, maybe they should have done it a long time ago.
Yeah, I think it's tough because open source also means tax deductible income. And especially when you're growing as a startup, you want a lot of contributions. You get a lot of good developer and customer feedback faster that way. So you're able to innovate quicker. But they run into this challenge being a public company. How do you justify an open source product that allows other companies to just take and copy your code? Well, you're the only one that contributes. So I think I remember seeing they contribute like 96% of the code and all the commits and PRs and everything like that. So it's really their product that's open source. And there are other products like Pulumi that use Terraform under the hood. And it's like, okay, well, why are we letting a competitor just copy our code? And then they're not even helping to contribute back. So it's a tough relationship to have.
So did you see, that was why I found this other one, because it talks about the source code remaining freely available, the right to copy derivative works, and make non-production, in quotes, use, unless, I like the word squirrely, you may be granted the right to use the code in production if you don't compete. Which is okay. And then there was the Joe Duffy, founder of rival infrastructure as code vendor Pulumi. We tried many times to contribute upstream fixes to Terraform providers, but HashiCorp would never accept them.
Yeah.
He just trashed.
I mean, it's
quote.
Yeah, it's this is just two competitors and they're playing politics, right? I mean, yeah, they want to contribute, but also, you know, how much do you let your competitor influence your product upstream? So it's a very interesting one. I did see kind of a cool layout of Kubernetes, for example, right? It starts with, you know, Linux and the host changes with the kernel or something like that. And then Kubernetes gets built, that's upstream. And then all the cloud providers take it downstream and make it secure, make it stable, et cetera, right? A lot of, I think with RHEL and CentOS, that was the whole point. It's like you have Fedora, then you have CentOS Stream, and then you have all the stable derivatives that come off of that, right? And it seems like that's what Hashi was trying to go for, but they went like over the top, I think, with the BSL, because now they just cut out like any sort of production use. That's not, like, do you still get the tax write-offs if you go with this license? I'm just very curious as to the business decision here.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. And Pulumi, if you're subscribed to Pulumi, did send immediately saying Pulumi is completely unaffected by this.
Mhm.
And I'm like, really? Okay.
Yeah, I wonder how much, because Pulumi, great product. I've actually talked to a lot of people that use it, and they like the flexibility of it, especially as a small startup. Small companies really like Pulumi, small to medium size, I'd say. But you got to be affected somewhat if you're using Terraform under the hood, right?
Right. Got to be, right? I didn't actually know Pulumi used Terraform under the hood. I know they have an intermediate language, which isn't Terraform, but is their platform communicating via Terraform?
Yeah. It takes Python, Go, whatever the code is, just maps it to Terraform, spits out the state file, and then says, hey, like we did the work for you so that you don't have to learn Terraform.
Interesting.
That's why I think it's really interesting, because if Pulumi is one of those things where you can put it in the hands of a developer to get the cloud resources that you want. But if you have an operations team that understands Ansible or Terraform, you don't need Pulumi. So it's interesting. It's like they just bridge that knowledge gap, that time gap.
It's interesting too, because we talked last week about Winglang. They were interesting, and they are a programmatic language that will then infer the creation of correct Terraform from what you write in your normal code. And I'm like, hold on, does this mess with them too? Because that's also a production use, but they're also open source, so maybe it's okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who knows?
But interesting to say the least. Good luck, Hashi, with all the questions coming your way. I'm sure the next month will be fun.
Yeah.
To some of the next news. We talked about this, I think, 2 weeks ago, or this came up, Kubernetes misconfigurations, unknowingly exposed data of Fortune 500 firm. I put this in WTF because the title is just ridiculous. It's like a partner of a Fortune 500 firm had unknowingly exposed this. Aquanalysis, to their credit, researched and found that kubectl proxy unknowingly exposed. So if you do a kubectl proxy and you have anonymous auth set to true, basically the kubectl proxy will let you in. Now that shouldn't be on by default. For example, if you're on OpenShift, that wouldn't work. Any sort of Kubernetes, you have to actually set up your cluster to allow this, like unlocking your front door and saying that your house is secure. But a lot of people were like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's in testing, or it's in staging, or it's not in production. It's like, oh, who cares what you found? And then if you go down the list, the Aqua shows like, oh no, we actually pulled a lot of your secrets, a lot of your stuff that you're using in production because you test it in testing. Like, we have access to this stuff. And then they're like, oh crap, and then they went and fixed it. So I thought that was really funny. Just the fact that Aqua says, hey, you're exposed, and then they come back with like, oh, it doesn't matter. Aqua's like, okay, here's your stuff. Oh damn, they found out. But it's making the waves. I remember I was looking on Google News. If you do Kubernetes and security, it's just this post about Aqua for like 10 articles, all paid. And it generated so much internal comment that people were like, oh, we have to come up with, like Red Hat's like, we have to come up with a blog saying like, it's secure. Use OpenShift. It's fine. Just don't expose your clusters like this. There's no need to like respond. But I feel like sometimes there's always a back and forth between security companies. Oh, you found this? Oh, well, Palo Alto found this.
Yeah. Right? Well, there definitely is. Yeah. So you say it was everywhere, meaning that not only is it, potentially interesting, they obviously paid for every possible vendor as well. Okay. Yeah.
No.
Not saying that we don't do that at our.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a known thing. It stirred up enough headlines that it made its way to our internal chat with people who aren't security focused, bringing it up and saying, hey, like, do we secure against this? What's going on? What is this? We have to be like, it's kind of important, but a nothing burger at the same time. Yeah. Anyways, on to, I think that's the end of the WTF. We're on to the big spenders. Yeah.
Yep.
It's a good section this week. Yes. We should have done breaking news for this. This just came across my desk last night. Yeah, this
Mhm.
came out yesterday at 2 p.m. SUSE is going private.
Yeah. Turns out they weren't doing that well. There's a lot
They
of down
spent
here.
all of almost 2 years on the stock market. I forget what her name was. I want to say it was like Melissa Donato. I want to say she was like Italian or something like that, because SUSE is based in Germany. She
Right.
took it public in 2021. Stocks got up to as high as $40 a share. They were all the way down at $9 a share when they got bought out yesterday, reportedly, for around 16, I think it says $16, $15 euro a share.
Yeah.
And for those that have been following, they've been picking up Red Hatters, ex-Red Hatters, left, right, and center.
Wow, what a surprise.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. They're going to go private, probably flip some of their models, because, like, for example, getting people who use Rancher to pay for Rancher has been a struggle for them, but very interesting to see that happen. It happened so quickly. Like, literally, they brought in a new CEO, boom, going private. Like,
yeah, it is pretty huge and interesting to see what, how the company changes as a result.
yeah, we'll see if they still want to maintain that the fork of RHEL or CentOS that they said they were going to spend $10 million on.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice one.
I think it's also really interesting that the company behind SUSE Linux Enterprise, Rancher, and NewVector, like, when they bought NewVector, I didn't think of it as like huge news. I just thought of them as following Red Hat, but NewVector is constantly in like every single media release, which is just, I don't know, from my marketing side, it's very interesting to me. All right, to some of the other big news. This one came out right after we finished the show on 2 weeks ago.
Endor, 17 million, Series A. Whoa.
Yeah.
That is a beast of an investment. Lightspeed Venture Partners, lots of other good people.
Yep, blue chip VCs. They had a little announcement on the stock market, that big screen in New York.
Yeah, of course.
So I think that brings them up to like 90 something. Yeah, 92 million in total of
their
funding.
seed was crazy.
Yeah, and this is, we were talking about, what was the company? Socket got 20 million in seed, right? And I found it really interesting that they released their Series A right after Socket said, hey, we got seed funding. And Socket basically is kind of a copy of Endor.
It looks like it, yeah.
It looks like it. I think that Sneak has identified the market, and then, like we were talking about earlier, now there's room for smaller players to get in and take that model and run with it. But
yeah, application security. So the application security market is estimated at around $1 billion, and it's largely dominated by old players. So you can see lots of new players. Endor, starting with I guess a more AI-driven SCA and control of the source code, to Backslash came out calling themselves application security. Binance calls themselves application security. Which we'll talk about in a moment. But everyone's jumping on the AppSec bandwagon. And in this article, the quote from, I think it's from Varun Badwar, application security is fundamentally broken. Too many tools, too much, or what he, and he's coined the idea, developer productivity tax.
Yeah.
That's a good quote. I don't know what it means, but I've never heard it before. And it sounds a little bit like the way Sneak positions themselves as developer friendly, but it's interesting to see that there's that much money that can be thrown into this, because the potential return for companies that do it right is pretty huge.
Yeah. Companies, we keep seeing like DevSecOps and pushing things on the developer and doing all this stuff. It's like, realistically, you don't want that. You don't want a company where the developer has to do 4 or 5 things to get their code to production and manage Kubernetes. Like, you want the developer to understand it. That's what makes them a good developer. But you want them to write code and ship it and not have to worry about 10,000 security notifications and vulnerabilities that don't affect them. So I'm on board with the development tax.
Yeah.
analogy. But yeah,
All
good
right.
luck, Endor. Congrats. That's pretty big, and
It's massive.
we'll see Series B early next year. They got a lot of runway.
Yeah, they got a lot of runway. That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
We'll see how much more they want to get. All right, on to the last big spender. You put this one in. Take it away.
CrowdStrike is close to acquiring Bionic AI for between 200 and 300 million. This is a weird article because this came out like, where did this information come from? Kind of a scenario. And what was also interesting, I think I was telling you about it, is that the name at the top of it was not this person when I first looked at it. There was a very different Israeli person up there. And given that Bionic is based in Tel Aviv, and there is a almost notorious style of, I don't know if it's leaking information, but if an example being when Palo Alto was thinking about buying Apiro, there was an article very much like this that said exactly this. Palo Alto is going to acquire Apiro. And it's like, what? Like, no, it didn't happen, right? But it was like this is definitely happening. So this does not mean this is happening. That's, I think, what we have to take with a grain of salt here. It just means they are probably talking.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. What I find really fascinating about it from a personal perspective is that I have spoken to lots of people in Bionic, and they were like big HashiCorp fans, right? They're like, yeah, we're going to, our baby's going to grow and become the most amazing AppSec platform ever. And they didn't seem like an early exit kind of people. But
markets change.
Then again, markets changed. It's a little droopy, and that's a lot of money.
Yeah. I do think there's some credence to what you're saying, because 200 to 300 million is a big range, and I feel like it's a lot of speculation. It's like, oh, you saw the Bionic people go into the CrowdStrike offices in Boston, and then you looked at how many people they had in their funding, and you're like, oh, it kind of makes sense if they're around here. Let's write the article, right?
Yeah.
Something like that happened. I don't know, but that's a pretty wide range to be speculating on. So yeah, stay tuned, and maybe you'll see Bionic AI in the big spender section again.
Yep.
Until then, we are on to some vulnerabilities.
Now, what starts with the letter C?
And always a great source for bad things, the Hacker News. New Python URL parsing flaw could enable command execution attacks. I was like, okay, let's see how bad it is. They come down, they've got and URL parse and URL lib, which is the standard Python. Everyone uses it, not a rare. It's everywhere. I have used it a good zillion times. I was saying there's a parsing problem if the entire URL starts with blank characters, which is hilarious because that's such a classic fuzzing like thing, just like, oh, we're gonna send URL, and let's just put some blank characters at the beginning. Oh, look, it doesn't work. So kind of fascinating that it's talking about parsing of host name and schema. And the example they've got is if you've got a block list, like saying you don't want this and that, it just ignores it. And very small article, but very simple. These are the versions, which is a lot of versions, probably most people's versions.
Yeah.
Where this is real. And yet it only has a 7.5. So I guess that is because it's not necessarily characterizable as always connected, but it probably is connected. It's a classic input validation issue. It's not like, so is it used or is it not used? So I didn't really dive in to see why it's as low as it is, even though it sounds bad. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there are other ways to mitigate something like this, depending on your host. And so it says this vulnerability would help an attacker to bypass the protections set by the developer for scheme and host. It can be expected to help SSRF and RCE, remote code execution, in a wide range of scenarios. So it's like they know that it can be used, but they're not sure how. Probably developed a fix in the new one, and I'm sure that there are mitigations on the host that you could take to combat this, maybe a wide range, which is why they're like, hey, pay attention to this. But if you have, one of 5 mitigations, then you're fine.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, interesting.
Very, very cool. Yeah, and no kidding. 3.12 all the way down to 3.7 in terms of that's a pretty wide ranging attack. All right, we have 15 minutes left. Let's do Podman Desktop.
Does everybody know what time it is?
All right, so Podman Desktop, this has been something I have been looking into for a while. Let me just bring it up here. Let's get Steve out of here and add me.
Yeah.
All right, and do this. Maybe get our heads out of there too. Okay, so Podman Desktop. For those who don't know, Red Hat has a, let's say, Docker alternative in Podman. You don't necessarily need to use Podman, but it is a Linux-based. It has all the functionality of Docker, and if you use Podman machines, it actually uses the Docker CLI as well, so it's open source from the beginning. Docker Desktop is just a UI to wrap around the Podman engine. So you think about the architecture. Basically, what you're looking at is, zoom in, I'm running it on Mac, for example. So in a virtual machine, you have the, I forget how to say it, QEMU. I don't know what the correct term is. QEMU emulator for a container. It goes and starts up. You then have Podman. So just like a Docker CLI, it interacts with the container engine to say, hey, I want you to start this container up, do these actions, expose this port. And then on top of that, you have the desktop. So one more layer of abstraction. It's documentation is pretty good. I'm not gonna lie, it was good. It showed me all the things that's going to go wrong on the install on the Mac, and I still tripped up. So it took me about an hour of playing around with Homebrew to get it done. If you're on an M1 or M2, it is not necessarily the easiest thing to install, but mostly because I'm an idiot and I don't know how to set up Homebrew on a new Mac. So like I said, download now. It saw that it was Mac OS. You can do other downloads. It's available. You can do a brew install Podman. That's what I did. I recommend if you're going to do homebrew, just don't use Rosetta. If you use Rosetta on an M1, M2, it's going to break. But you get into something like this. Hold on, let me. Oh, I don't know what I did.
You just crash it.
No, this is just what sucks about having 3 screens and trying to get all this working at one time. Okay. Present. Share screen.
I need to go get my guitar, entertain people.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, it's going to be a wide screen share, but have fun with this one. Oof. There we go. Can't see anything though. Let me zoom in here.
Really small. There we go. Lovely.
Okay. Let's get rid of that. Hopefully you guys can see this all right. We'll drop this to the bottom. Okay, there we go.
That looks really good.
Okay, sweet. So when you get in to Podman Desktop, you'll see the version. There's the website installation, Docker compatibility guide, and the community shout out. It's kind of cool, the featured extensions. So it shows I have Podman. I had Docker running, so I can use the Docker engine. I can also use Podman. You can use either if you have enough space on your computer to do it. I didn't get into looking what this is. I'm assuming that, oh, it's Linux virtual machines. So that's what's being used on the host to create the space for Podman. Lima, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Have Kind installed. You can do an OpenShift local install or a Red Hat developer sandbox. So a little shout out there from Red Hat putting that in. It is kind of cool that with one click you can install and they'll just put the containers in there for a local OpenShift environment. So pretty easy to install that. You come over here, create a container from a container or contain. I love this container file or Docker file.
What's the difference?
Docker file is branded. Container file is agnostic.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. It's marketing definitely pushed that in there. So you can either create it from a container or Docker file or pick an existing image. For example, these are 2 images that I've downloaded that I've used. You can edit the image, show the history. I can click on this, run it. So I'm going to create a container from that core image, add an entry point, add a container name. I can go to advanced, attach a sudo terminal, specify the user to run as. automatically remove the container when the process exits, have a restart. You can set up your custom DNS server, add a host name, IP address, specific mode, no networking, host networking, right? So there's all these features that would typically be in that container file you can do during the setup. So I found it really cool to get this set up. Also, security. Shout out for the tab. Turn off security. And good thing they put that there. Otherwise, I would have clicked it.
Oh, yeah.
Make it read-only, certain security options, SecOp profiles, etc. Right? So same thing that you'd see in Kubernetes. Cap add, sysadmin, things like that. Enter kernel capability, specify a namespace to use even, which I found was interesting that was there. So I'm like, these are advanced features. But yeah, at the end, I can just say like, hey, start container, goes and starts it. You can see I was playing around with this last night. This one's been up. Stop that. Maybe I want to get rid of these. I'll just delete those. We can also prune certain containers. We'll prune all unused containers from the engine. That's one of my favorite features because I hated playing around in the CLI, finding all the containers and, Docker ps-a to find them all, etc.
Yeah.
So very cool for that. The one thing I found interesting is if you go to play Kubernetes YAML, it sees existing contexts.
Ooh.
So this cluster is not up, but I'm assuming if it is up, then I can connect directly to that Kubernetes cluster and start interacting with the YAMLs. Maybe use like the remote cluster at the same time that I'm local. I don't know. I stumbled on this one last night and I didn't have enough time to bring up my Kubernetes cluster to play around, but it's interesting what they're trying to do.
Is that because you have a kube config even though the cluster's not running?
Yeah. So, and I'm wondering if the thought is like, let's say you have a test environment and you're developing locally. Well, like I develop locally, I just build it in the container, do that all here. And then I can just say, hey, put this image onto the Kubernetes test cluster and run it. It's like, okay, you're good. Like here's the config file.
Yeah. I do a lot of testing just with local containers spin up and then push to the cluster. The fact you can do it here, I think would be pretty cool.
So these are interesting. These are the containers, but then these are the pods.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think they just differentiate between like Kubernetes pods and containers that are running. I think, not completely sure why they're separating the two. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is like,
both there.
Yeah. So this is a container. So I created a container locally, but then you can also create a pod, which is different. I mean, I know pods obviously in Kubernetes are different, but it's weird that there's two.
You can have multiple containers in a pod.
Yeah. Also you can inspect it, can look at the logs, look at the summary. It said generate queue, but I don't really know what it's asking. Maybe because I stopped that one. That's why. Yeah. So see, like you can say like deploy to Kubernetes, update the manifest, expose the service.
Oh, it gives you some good advice.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that if I had Kubernetes, whatever that YAML file that I've set up, like the specific context, that it would just go and deploy there. Yeah. These are your images. So this is just an easy one that they give you just to say, hey, set up, a hello world image. And then I downloaded Ubuntu as well from Docker.io. To pull an image, you select an image, but you also need to put in the registries. So you can do this, I believe, in settings. You go to registries, you configure your username and password. Yes, that is my username. Don't hack me. Red Hat Quay, GitHub, GCR, authentication, extensions. Again, this is an interesting one. It's all a new extension from OCI image, but I think that those are pretty neat. You can disable or keep context is there. Kind, Docker, compose. You can disable all of them. And of course, you have all the preferences, exit on close, auto update, path to kube config file, minimize login, the typical stuff. And then the last thing I want to give a shout out to is volumes. So you have to create the volumes on the host in order for Podman to use it. Makes sense. You have to do the same thing for Docker, but kind of here. Let's
That
see.
shows you how to do it, as opposed
Yeah.
to you becoming a Podman expert.
Yeah, and there you go. I just ran that in terminal, and then all of a sudden this volume's up. So it doesn't create volumes in here, which is interesting. Like you have to actually create the volume in the terminal.
Okay.
Yeah. Print volumes. Things that I think could be different / improved on. I think I had to zoom in a lot for this bottom bar. I think it could be bigger.
Oh yeah.
Right. I think it could be slightly bigger with the images a little bit. Also, when you hover over these things, it says volumes. I don't understand why they didn't just expand this a little bit and just put like dashboard, containers, pods, images, volumes.
There isn't like that's the maximum size for that sidebar.
I'm in the widescreen, so it's very zoomed in.
Yeah.
So it's kind of tough, but yeah, like if I'm at,
God.
I think, yeah, like it's very small in comparison to the screen, especially even if you're on just your major laptop, it is quite small. So
Okay. Makes sense.
I'm just always curious, like when you have an install, the first use, you kind of want to know, okay, like what are these? Now I have to hover over and I have to remember. Also, I see that images changes. It has a little 2 thing there. Why don't you just have that? Just say like, hey, you have 10 images, and it's just there on the left, showing you exactly how many there are. Maybe they want to keep it clean, which completely understand.
Yeah.
Thoughts? Anything that I hovered over that piques your interest?
Just an overall holistic question about is Podman that used or that complex that this is a required tool? Like, what problem was it solving, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's just going into the space of Docker containers and trying to be a developer tool, right? Developers, so you're in VS Code, you want to go and package it into Docker. Podman solves that solution. If you just want to use the CLI, works virtually the same as Docker. That being said, a lot of people are still new to containers, and it's easy to go in and say, hey, okay, I see my containers are running. Let me test it. Let me see what's going on. Little things like this. We can check to see, you can see Podman. I can ping, check containers. 2 containers are there, right? You can see logs. It is pretty nice to have this all in a dashboard and not just doing CLI commands and having to learn, Podman, ls-a, and etc. So, seeing auth providers, it can see all the icons, containers, configurations. So things like that, I think, are pretty useful.
Okay, that's pretty cool. And it's free, right? Is that
Yep. Yeah. Open source, free. Also, I think from a developer standpoint, if you had like OpenShift local, or if you were an OpenShift developer, or if you're a Kubernetes developer and you wanted to use kind, right? And you have your build and your test environment all local, I think there's a huge advantage just to say like, okay, I built this, move it over into kind, test it out. Okay, it's good. Okay, ship it or check the code in or something like that. I think that's a huge value add.
Nice. That looks pretty cool. Pretty fully featured.
Yeah. Version 4.6.1. I know they've been putting a lot of work into this one. So I want to test out the Kubernetes features now. I got to go spin up a GKE cluster and see if I can just push my image back and forth and check that out.
Yeah, that would then make it really cool. Awesome.
It does. Right on time, right at the top of the hour. Steve, we're going to be back in 2 weeks, right?
Yep.
All right. Steve's on tool time in 2 weeks. I'll have a hot take for you. I already got one in the chamber. Until next time, he's Steve Jaguar. I'm Mike Foster. This is C9K, and have a lovely weekend.